Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Sarah Marshall. Sarah, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm a traveling journalist and semi-professional dog sitter, and we're going to talk today about Disney and Satan. They're two of my recent topics.
Right.
Recent and recurring themes, actually.
and possibly dogs. We'll see how the conversation goes. As I say that, my cat is jumping up to rub her face against the computer, as she always does during these recordings.
You got to have the third guest, the second guest.
Yeah. She comes in a little too soon, though, sometimes. We did an episode about it a little more than a year ago about Titanic. That was one of my favorite conversations I've had on this platform. So I'll link to that below. And I encourage people to check that out. And you wrote a great piece about the making of Titanic. But okay, we're not talking about that today. We're talking about Satan. But more specifically, the satanic ritual abuse panic that happened in the 1980s. So you also host a podcast. Is it called You're Wrong About?
It is. You're wrong about ... technically.
Okay, so we'll link to that also. And I think the first episode of that is about this topic, right? About the
about the satanic panic, as
this was our story.
Yeah, we were starting this podcast, and I was like, well, I've always wanted to do more research on the satanic panic. Like, that's always seemed weird to me, and started reading, and essentially have not stopped. And it's now been 15 months, and there are just topics where. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Getting a call from a mysterious LA number. I think it's some sort of fund for something. Yeah, there are topics that choose you, and that it's like wandering into a maze, and then you're like, well, I live here now. I'm not good at mazes.
Okay, so you're within the story. So probably, I don't know, I guess maybe it depends how old you are, whether you know about this story. And I maybe only heard about it growing up, because as I mentioned to you, one of the places where this happened was in the town next to mine, and I grew up in South Orange, New Jersey, and one of the daycares where this happened was in Maplewood, New Jersey. Something like you remember the name? I don't even. It's like We Care, yeah. And it was a woman named Margaret Kelly Michaels, and this was like really like one of the first big cases, because the first big case in the U.S. was the McMartin daycare case in Southern California, which was started in 1983. And once that appeared in the news, just all these other cases popped up around the country. And so it kind of jumps from Southern California to Maplewood, New Jersey, to Miami, Florida, to Jordan, Minnesota. But yeah, that was... I see that as one of, I've started visualizing the satanic panic as kind of a literal epidemic, and thinking a lot about like Stephen King's The Stand, Stephen King's The Stand, or the Andromeda Strain. And, that this is one of the first places where you can see the Captain Trips showing up. Well, I mean, I'm so curious. What do you recall about that from this vantage point of like, one of the, the idea of being kind of an actual child at this time is so interesting too, because, my connection to it, I was born in 1988, and my mom at the time just took it as a given that like, I'm not putting my kid in daycare. It is too dangerous. Like, your dad is going to take care of you, and that's why we're going to stay married. And I do not have a good relationship with my father, who, there were many reasons that he was a stay-at-home dad during those years. Like, he wasn't interested in working, and there was like a baby, and like he needed to take care of the baby. But like that, like, I have spent the last 30 years of my life hearing about how he had done this like above and beyond thing of taking care of a child, which no man in history has done before and ever had again. And, and just with this sense of like debt that I owed to him for like not letting me die, essentially, because that was just the way that his resentment manifested. It was going to come out some other way. Like it was, if it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. But, I was talking to my mom recently, and she was like, well, I wasn't going to put you in daycare. And I was like, am I also a product of the Satanic Panic? Like, are my dad issues caused by some journalist getting excited in LA in the early 80s? Like, really?
That's fascinating. Yeah, so I just, I was born in 83, so I was too young to understand anything, while it was happening. But I was aware of it as I got a little bit older. Like, I did go to daycare. It wasn't that one.
And you made it?
Yeah, survived somehow. But yeah, I do have a memory of, like, driving somewhere and my mom or dad, like, being like, oh, that's that building over there where that thing happened, 10 years ago or whatever. And I kind of vaguely remember people just like joking about it or referring to it or something, but it wasn't like, this is the, big event that like everyone is obsessed with in town, or the event that no one wants to talk about anymore since it was so disgraceful. I guess it was more like kind of an oddity. But why don't we say, for people who don't know, why don't we kind of say lay out what happened in this weird historical episode?
Yeah. So the Satanic Panic comes out of the fact that in the late 70s, America suddenly realized that child sexual abuse was a thing that happened, which people had kind of known before, but just the Kinsey report, I believe, argues that, it's 1 in a million. And it's, the general sense, and what you hear about from people who experienced some form of sexual abuse in the 50s and 60s, and, usually perpetrated by a family member, because that's how cases break down statistically. That's normally what happens. It's someone in the family or known to the family and kind of trusted, is that, a family member, if it was an extended family member, would molest a child, and then the parents would be like, okay, like, we found out, like, we're not going to leave you alone with Uncle Phil anymore. We're not going to make a scene about it. We're not going to go to the police. Like, we're not going to pull apart the family or anything like that. Like, we're just going to quietly remove you from the situation. And if we don't talk about it to you, and if we don't communicate to you that it was a bad thing that happened, then, like, you will forget about it. And I think that did happen to a lot of people, where we encode memory based on our sense of whether or not it was significant. And if there's nothing in the way that something that happened to you is, received by your family members that validates the fact that it was a bad thing, then you will be less likely to have clear memories of it, potentially. You will not have people around you communicating to you that this was important. And if there is a sense of kind of family mandated amnesia about it, where like everyone literally remembers what happened, but we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to make a big deal out of it. Like, we must maintain a good, we must be able to all be polite to each other. Like, this seemed to be the way that people reacted to child abuse kind of in middle America, in the baby boomer years. And so my sense is that a lot of women who then started having children in the 80s had suffered some form of abuse that just was not taken seriously when they were growing up, and had a sense of, not this time, not now. Like, I'm not going to treat my child that way, which was all completely justifiable. And
did you just to side note? Have you seen the Netflix documentary "Abducted in Plain Sight"?
No. What's that about?
I would recommend it. It's on the theme of a child predator, but it's a very, very strange story that has a number of twists that are so unbelievable that if they were in a book or a movie, you would say this could never happen in real life. But like, it actually happened to this family in Idaho. Basically, a family friend kidnapped like a 9 or 10-year-old girl. And a lot of like really strange things happened after that, but it was very much like after it happened, it was like, yeah, let's just not talk about this anymore. They even let the guy keep on coming over and hanging out and even sleeping in the girl's bed with the family's permission. So it was a lot of really, really strange things happening. The family and the perpetrator are both Mormon. That seemed to have played some role in the way they viewed these things. But yeah, I recommend if you're interested in this topic or just want to watch a really strange story, Abducted in Plain Sight. Okay, but continuing on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there was a sense in the United States that we had ignored child sexual abuse for so long, which we had, and now somehow needed to make up for that. And so, this enters the public conversation in the late 70s. It becomes a feminist issue. It becomes something where, in this way that we see over and over with abuse dynamics, like so many people, especially in the conversation around feminism, so many women thought that they were the only ones, and they weren't, and they realized how widespread it was. And so I think there was this sense of, we need to take sexual abuse seriously, because there's also literature, mid-century psychiatric literature, saying that, an adult man exposing himself to a small child, it's like, yes, it's upsetting, but it's like seeing a spider, and it's like, it's just not. And I can see wanting to believe that, and wanting to believe that, that kind of harm is not real, but it is. And, there has just been this cultural history of denial and also of not taking seriously the traumatic experiences of children. And so there's just this swerve into overcorrection. And at the same time, women who grew up in this culture of abuse that just gets ignored or invalidated or shoved under the rug want to do right by their own children. And so out of all of these good intentions, we get the McMartin case, which is just a fascinating example of a spark falling on exactly the right tinder. Honestly, a good kind of companion piece to all this would be, there's a wonderful article, I believe, by Skip Hollandsworth in Texas Monthly about just like a spate of not wildfires, just like fires that sweep through dry, grassy farmland in the Texas Panhandle, and how just, like that, you have just a down power line, and then suddenly it hits exactly the right fuel, and it just spreads in a flash. And that was kind of what the attitudes in America were, I think, in the early 80s. And so the McMartin case begins when at McMartin, which is the kind of, I want to double check on if it was a preschool or a daycare, because that's an important, I want to say preschool, but like I'm getting to the age where like I don't trust my retention of anything. Yeah, it was a preschool. At McMartin, is kind of known as the best preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. The school that you want to get your kids into. It's an institution. It's been there for decades. It's trusted. It's loved. A kid comes home one day. He's 2 or 3 years old, and his mother determines that, based on some things that he says, and part of the trouble of this too is that we can't, these conversations get kind of reconstructed and narrativized, and it's hard to know now, what did he say or do that gave her this sense. But his mother suspects that he was anally sodomized at school, and goes to the police. And what we later learn, what the public much later learns, is that she's diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and that she dies many years later from complications of acute alcoholism. And the claims that she's bringing to the police and to the district attorney as this case develops become increasingly strange and unlikely to the point of impossibility. But she goes to the police with her worry that her son has been abused at his preschool, and the police respond by, taking down her allegations, all of which are, and she continues to question her son and to get more claims
develop more claims from talking with him. And then the police, because this is the early 80s and they have not worked on cases like this before really, and they're just kind of flying blind, send a letter to current and to parents. The police send a letter to parents of current and former students at McMartin saying, we have reason to believe that a child at McMartin has been abused, and here is a list of what may have happened to your child, like these very graphic things. I can read you the list if you want.
Sure, why not?
Let me find it. I have some of my materials here. So it's an excellent history. We Believe the Children by Richard Beck. Let's see. I just happen to have it right here. Okay. Okay, so this is September of 1983. Dear parent, this department is conducting a criminal investigation involving child molestation. Ray Bucky, an employee of Virginia McMartin's preschool, was arrested September 7th, 1983 by this department. Records indicate that your child has been or is currently a student at the preschool. We are asking your assistance in this continuing investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of, quote, taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing. Any information from your child regarding having ever observed Ray Bucky to leave the classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Bucky tie up a child, is important. We ask you to keep this investigation strictly confidential because of the nature of the charges and the highly emotional effect it could have on our community. Please do not discuss this investigation with anyone outside your immediate family. And I've written in the margin as if, which I stand by as a comment. And so, just what would you guess happens next?
Right. So, I've listened to your episode talking about this, but so the obvious, even if I hadn't listened to it, the obvious objection is like, if you talk to a 3 or 4-year-old and ask them what happened, like, over the last 6 months, they're not going to give you an accurate answer. And that seems obvious to me. And why was it not obvious to these people 37 years ago?
There's an idea at play here that I think we still have in this country, and it is a very human thing, which is that there's this idea. And so what happens, of course, is that parents question their children, and children, even if they are obstinate that nothing happened, they don't know what they're talking about, they don't remember anything, they then get taken to social workers who are doing the questioning for the police, led by a woman named Kee McFarland, who's claiming to have a degree that she does not have that would qualify her to do this work. And essentially one child will, under parental or adult pressure, produce a scenario, and then the other children will be pressured to corroborate it. So little kids are being treated like, perps questioned by the police that are trying to get them to flip on their co-defendants. And there's a sense that you can see animating this whole investigation that, children don't lie, children don't make up stories, like children tell the truth. And it's like, it doesn't say anything bad about the child that if they're being pressured by an adult or if they're being taken by an adult into kind of a play acting scenario where, they're playing with dolls and puppets and sort of, kids at that age, 3 and 4-year-olds, slip very easily into sort of play and imagination and then quickly back into real life. And, it's not saying anything unkind about them to say that what they're saying isn't the literal truth. Like they're in situations where they feel they're being asked to play imagination games, or where adults are pressuring them to support a story that some other child has told. And, this was recorded. And so we have transcripts of social workers saying to these kids, your friend told us what happened. Like, why don't you tell us? Do you want us to think that you're dumb? Mm-hmm. Or you have to help the littler kids. You're one of the big kids, and you have to help the littler kids by telling us this story too. And if you don't help us, then, you're not going to save the little kids from bad stuff happening to them, and just the kind of pressure tactics that work pretty well with adults. Like, adults will confess to crimes that they didn't commit or implicate people in crimes that they, didn't witness. Like, it's not that hard to get a grown-up to do that kind of thing. And we're using that kind of pressure on small children. And I think that in the case that you grew up in the neighboring town to, the case in Maplewood, there's a memoir written by the mother of one of the alleged victims that's called Not My Child. And it's about how, after this alleged abuse took place, her daughter suddenly starts, behaving in ways that only an abused child would behave in, and they're normal toddler and little kid behaviors, parents. And in all these cases, this is kind of a general phenomenon too, that parents say, after the abuse, this explains why my kid started, hitting, or like put her finger in her anus, or started masturbating, or lying, or, being difficult. And it's like, you might have just gotten a regular kid. The kid might just be acting like a kid. Uh-huh. And, I think that the ways that we idealize the child also lead us to really believe in these fantasy versions of children that don't exist. And we, in the end, punish our children for not conforming to that.
Mm-hmm. So how does the satanic part come in? Yeah. Is that in the first case, or is that held until some of the later cases?
The satanic part comes up in McMartin, and the way that it does is because there's a book that has come out in 1980 that became a minor bestseller called Michelle Remembers, which is a case in which a Canadian woman went into therapy with the therapist she'd had in college, and returned to this guy named Lawrence Pastor. And they went through a 15-month-long series of sessions where he regressed her, or, attempted to regress her, to recover memories of her childhood, because she came in with just general depression. She just had a miscarriage. She was grieving that in a way that seemed, that her doctor didn't think made sense, which I think could also have a lot to do with just, the medical establishment not really making space for the grief that can accompany miscarriage. Mm-hmm. And I think she had a sense that, women also tend to have after a miscarriage of, why didn't my body not do the one thing that it's supposed to be able to do? What's wrong with me? And just carrying these general feelings of unworthiness and, just having trouble coping the way that human beings do. And her therapist, who had worked with her for quite a long time previously, was like, well, we've gone over your whole childhood, so there's nothing, literally in what you've told me of your past that could explain this. So, like, maybe there's something you don't remember. And sorry, hold on. And so he starts regressing her to her memories as a 5-year-old, and she first produces a scenario about, this, what feels like kind of a dream vision of her mother takes her to this house, and these adults, pick her up and point her in the cardinal directions, and then there's, candles and chanting, and Dr. Pastor is like, well, that sounds kind of potentially satanic. And they start kind of leading each other toward that. And so she, and what happens, and what we see in the 80s and the boom of recovered memory therapy, which becomes
extremely, has what we now call a moment at this time, is that an experience that certainly hundreds, perhaps thousands of women have, is going into a therapist, and, at a certain point, you can go in for anything. You can go in for an eating disorder. You can go in because you have mild depression. You can go in just because you want to try therapy and work through some stuff. And a therapist who is trained in this school of thought will tell you, you were sexually abused, and I can tell, even if you can't. And even though you have no memories of this, I will help you to recover the memories and to relive the trauma, and then you will be better. And women during this time came in and were like, yes, I was sexually abused and it happened on these occasions and this is what happened and this is what I remember. And therapists will say, no, that's not traumatic enough. There's something else. You've repressed some worse abuse and we have to, don't do my job for me. Like, I will tell you what you experienced and what you did not, and go through a process of attempting to recover memories that involves, many therapists use hypnosis, which we know from the studies that have been conducted on hypnosis that, hypnosis is a relaxation technique. It essentially means that you can be highly focused on one aspect of your thoughts and lose focus on your surroundings or on kind of other aspects of your mind. I've been hypnotized. It was great. It did not lead me any closer to objective truth in my personal anecdotal experience than other methods have. It's not a magic tool for getting back to the actual past. It's a way of essentially being highly focused on what you're being asked to pay attention to, and also being highly suggestible. And so if you use hypnosis, or more to the point, someone uses hypnosis on you to refresh your memory or kind of take you back to focus on your memory of something that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago, you will not be any likelier to be literally accurate in your memories, but you will be much more confident that what you remember is true once you've been hypnotized, which is part of why it's useful as a police tool, because if you use hypnosis on a witness, you won't get any closer to the truth necessarily just by using hypnosis. You will make someone much more suggestible to your version of events if you are consciously or unconsciously leading them toward a certain determined outcome. For example, if you think you know who committed this crime and you're hypnotizing someone to try and get them to recall something that they witnessed, and you will create a very compelling witness because they will have increased confidence in what they testify to, regardless of whether or not it actually happened. And so hypnosis is used a lot in recovered memory therapy in the 80s. There's also techniques like, even if you have no memories, tell yourself that you were abused, because your therapist knows you must have been, because you have bulimia, and God knows that, there's no other reason why anyone becomes bulimic. And live with the knowledge that you've been abused for 6 months and see if memories happen. Or if you have, a image, if an image flashes into your head of, of some kind of abuse event, then, that's not a random thought. That is a flashback. That's a memory. And now we have to take it in and expand it into a scenario. Or, keep a dream journal. And then whatever you dream of is necessarily a link to the past. It's necessarily a reflection of what literally happened to you. And so it's all of these techniques that essentially, say whatever images you encounter, whatever thoughts you have are 100% accurate to what you experienced as a child. And I, your therapist, am 100% qualified to know the truth of them, and I will help you now to expand them into scenarios. And what happens is that women recover alleged memories and go through what therapists at the time call abreaction, which is where you have to relive the traumatic event and relive the trauma of it, and essentially
experience this form of victimhood that you're describing in a pretty real way. And when you don't get better, because we don't actually become whole people at any time in our lives, we're just fragile, weird humans, and that's what this is all about. When you don't get better, when you don't integrate and become well and whole again, then your therapist will say to you, okay, there's worse stuff. You're repressing stuff still. We have to go back in. We have to keep digging. And that's how we get these pretty commonplace progressions where you come in, you have no memories of abuse. You go through these memory recovery techniques, which your therapist tells you, never produce false memories, never lead anyone to believe something happened to them that didn't. And when what you recall is not severe enough to make you better, then you have to keep unearthing worse and worse traumas. And so it goes from my family member molested me to I was abused satanically to I was a member of an intergenerational coven and I was used to breed babies that were sacrificed for Satan for years and years. I mean, there's
plot of a recent horror movie that came out a year or two ago, Hereditary. Really? Yeah.
Oh yeah, yes, exactly. It's like that, but without Toni Collette ever involved. And so this is there is a ton of satanic ritual abuse narrative also in the recovered memory movement and therapy in the 80s. And it gets its start with Michelle Remembers, because in the same way that we see in, what happens to women in therapy later on, Michelle, recovers a memory of this kind of uncomfortable and unpleasant, but not necessarily Satanist, not particularly horrific ritual that she's used and they keep going and things get progressively worse. And there's this sense of we have to get to the worst thing that you ever experienced and then you'll be better and then you'll come out the other side. And it goes to, she's in these therapy sessions for 6 hours a day and it dominates her entire life and is just, there. And this therapy is recorded and becomes the material that makes up much of the book. And so there's a lot of material in there that's her saying, I can't, I feel like I'm going crazy. I can't believe that these memories are real. I can't believe that I really did these things. How could, this is too horrible. I can't go on. And her doctor's like, no, you have to keep going. We have to keep regressing or you'll never get out the other side. We have to get through. And the way that narrative resolves for her is that they are at this ritual, and after we've seen, they're sacrificing kittens and sacrificing babies and keeping her in a cage filled with snakes for, weeks on end. And during a period when, there are records showing that she was in school and had fine attendance and had, 2 sisters who weren't mentioned in the book and who said none of this ever happened. I mean, there's gray area and everything, but there are key aspects of the narrative that are directly contradicted by the records that we have. The way this narrative resolves is that the Satanists hold a ritual that goes on for weeks on end and finally summons forth Satan, who has all of the, speaks in verse, which is, that's hard. It's hard to get someone to speak in rhymes continually. And that's a tough,
well, if you're the, Prince of Darkness or supernatural being.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, right. It does corroborate the idea that someone has supernatural powers. They can speak in spontaneous rhymes because I can't do that. Satan speaks in all of these poems about, and the gist of it always is that, there is no love in the world. There's only darkness. Embrace me, embrace darkness, embrace despair. You will never be loved. Love is stupid. And that in this scenario, Michelle defies Satan and refuses to be tempted into doubt and despair, essentially. And then the Virgin Mary comes and tells her, you have been made to see all this so that you can warn the world, and like your suffering served a purpose, and you are loved, and it's okay. And so it becomes this redemption narrative where it's about, rejecting the figures that tell you that love is an illusion and you're not worthy of it, and embracing a way of life that says that love exists and you can love and be loved, which is like the central drama of all of our lives. Like I think it reflects truth. But it's narrativized in a way that that readers take as literal truth. And so there's all of the questions around this therapy that is depicted in this book, and then the book is published in 1980, sells a few 100,000 copies, like does pretty well. But then Michelle and her therapist, who she has since married, Lawrence Pasder, they start going to speak at seminars and trainings for social workers who are being trained on how to recognize signs of sexual abuse and how to question children who may have been abused. And so Lawrence Pasder is a consultant, and the book is being, handed out to psychotherapists and to social workers and treated as a clinical text of some kind, which it is not.
Mm-hmm.
Books, nonfiction books aren't fact checked. And so Lawrence Pasder is brought on as a consultant at some point in the McMartin investigation. And essentially that's where the social workers who were working on that case got the idea to start, let's ask the kids about, was there any satanic stuff happening? Like, were you forced to drink blood? Were you forced to drink urine? Did you sacrifice animals? Like, was there chanting? Were there robes? Were there black candles? Like anything like that. And this is, they're already pretty aggressively questioning these little kids about all sorts of other things that the kids begin by, many of them begin by saying did not happen to them. And then after a while say, well, yes, it did. Because the social workers are also trained to believe that if a child says, no, I was not abused, then that's denial. And that is further evidence that they were. So if you obstinately say that nothing happened, then that's like another piece of evidence that something absolutely did happen. So really kind of into this goulash is thrown, and if you're already being asked about, things that seem just kind of hard to comprehend as a child who none of this has happened to, like oral sodomy, anal sodomy, the kinds of sex acts that really are quite rare in sexual abuse cases, because it's, the breakdown is it's most commonly things that are non-penetrative and non-violent, and that, that's the reason that that America could ignore sexual abuse for so long, was because you could talk yourself into believing that, yeah, it happened, but it's not that bad. They won't remember it. It wasn't, it's not as bad as it could have been. Let's just all move on and keep going to Thanksgiving like we always do. In this case, the starting allegations are so severe that if you throw into that, like, well, did you ever drink animal blood, or were there ever robes? You can, I can see that as a child, it would be very easy to be like, yeah, sure, robes, whatever, throw in robes. Fine. Yes, there were robes. And we kicked a pony to death, I guess.
But then it also became like some kids saying, they were levitated or people were flying around the room.
Yeah. Like that Ray Buckby flew in the air was one of the, and that claim might have been there from the beginning. And then later, can be, and then we get into this uncomfortable area where, and so once McMartin appears in the news, which is in the spring of '84, I believe, then the satanic ritual abuse allegations are much publicized because they're sensational and interesting. And then in other cases, in other daycare centers and other parts of America where parents are, similarly just anxious and scared and feeling like, oh my God, like if this
if this preschool that was prestigious and loved in its community and existed without any sign of trouble for 25 years was satanically and sexually abusing children in huge numbers, and everyone was in on it, which is, what the reports are saying at the time, and we tend to trust the news, then like, who's to say that the same thing isn't happening where I live? Who's to say that the same thing isn't happening at my daycare center, at my preschool? If there was no sign of it outwardly there either. And once you believe that there can be such a widespread conspiracy and that so many awful things could be happening with no outward sign of it, then like, sure, throw in ritual abuse. Like that's at a certain point no more unbelievable than anything else. And where it gets problematic is when these cases start going to trial and district attorneys start thinking, well, we kind of might lose credibility with a jury if we're alleging that people were flying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when these cases go to trial, interestingly enough, the ritual abuse allegations tend not to be part of the charges, tend not to be named at trial because they're seen as impeding the credibility of the case generally. But if you're questioning a child and they're telling a story or producing a story for you that involves equal part sexual abuse and satanic abuse, and you throw out the satanic abuse for being unbelievable, you have to wonder about the material that you're getting through using the exact same methods of questioning.
Yeah. Okay, so multiple people were convicted in various places around the country of abuse and went to jail.
About 190.
Okay, so that's more than multiple. That's a lot of people.
A lot.
And when did people start to look at this again? Were cases overturned, or how did people realize that this was like a massive disaster?
It's funny. I feel like there was never a large scale reckoning with this, and so there are certain people who kind of early in the game started saying, I don't know, this doesn't really make sense to me. And I think the first journalist who really started speaking out about this consistently, I think, was Debbie Nathan, who wrote a book eventually called Satan's Silence about, I guess, investigating these cases and finding that they really dead-ended into nothing. And she wrote about the Margaret Kelly Michaels case in New Jersey. And that was a case where, so the McMartin case was, until the O.J. Simpson trial, the most expensive trial in California history. And I believe the longest. Like, it holds all these superlatives and ended in no convictions. It was a long, wild goose chase. And, people, eventually went free, but this was after losing, the McMartin family lost their business, became pariahs in the community, lost years of their lives to this investigation and prosecution. And it's similar throughout. The best case scenario is that you lose your money and your identity and your reputation and your time. And so one of the next big cases was the Margaret Kelly Michaels case at We Care in New Jersey. She was convicted and was given, an incredibly stiff sentence and was eventually exonerated, but only after having served for several years. And that was a high-profile conviction and a high-profile exoneration. And by the time that happened, I think that part of it was just that these cases had been in the news for long enough, and Americans had had long enough to sit with the kind of outrageousness of the allegations and with watching, enough cases that kind of fell apart as they were being prosecuted, although certainly many of them didn't, for the tide to just start turning gradually toward doubt. But there was never... there's never been any kind of national systematic convictions integrity review about, satanic abuse allegations, just as there's really very little systematic convictions integrity review at all in this country. There certainly with recovered memory therapy,
the movement, the same thing kind of happened. There wasn't kind of a period when there was a big case that got national attention, or a big exoneration where America kind of sat up and was like, wait a minute, like no, like this isn't happening. This isn't real. It's more that the will to prosecute kind of calmed down, and it kind of fizzled, and you had these headline generating arrests and indictments. And then, I think certainly the McMartin case not leading to any convictions was a big part of it, in a sense that, like, if we had this case that started out so promisingly with like these dozens of children producing these stories, and these, that we've caught this whole nest of monsters up, and, we have them, like, if we couldn't convict these people, then like maybe there's something wrong with this whole scenario. But I honestly don't think that there was ever a period when America kind of came to grips with the fact that we had so strongly believed such an unlikely story and destroyed so many people's lives because of it. I think it was more that we just gradually lost interest and became fixated on other things.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, people would rather not grapple with the mistakes they made in the past. But speaking of that, I mean, have any of the children like come forward as adults to talk about their experience and what they remember happening?
I mean, I found very little of that, and I'm very interested in that. It's just, what was it like as a kid to, and certainly, just by mathematically, a lot of these people who were children at the time, if you're asked to tell a story and to rehearse it over and over again and to testify about it eventually, like, we make memory by telling stories. My memories are not real. They are my good faith effort to reconstruct or to tell myself a story about what happened when. But like, every time I retell a story, I get a little bit farther away from how it actually happened. And if you, as a very small child, are asked to believe and live and relive a narrative where you were a victim of terrible abuses, then like, that's traumatic. You went through real trauma. And if your family is putting pressure on you to implicate a possibly beloved caregiver and you don't, and that causes, friction between you and your family, then that too is a trauma. And, possibly producing the story that all the trusted adults in your world want you to produce, and knowing maybe deep down and carrying the knowledge that it's not true and that you contributed to, putting someone that you once cared about in jail, then that's a trauma. Like, we did create a generation of traumatized children on top of the sexual abuse that was happening in America. There is a child who, once a child, now an adult, but a man named Kyle Zerpolo, who was at McMartin and who was pressured by his mother and stepfather to, we know something happened to you, like, we're going to keep taking you in to be questioned by these social workers, just do what we want you to do, who produced this testimony and always was aware that it wasn't true, and who later on, and this was written kind of as told to Debbie Nathan, apologized to the McMartin family and to the workers at that preschool for being part of that. And their response was, you don't owe us an apology. You were a little kid.
Yeah, it's hard to see any moral culpability for like a 4-year-old, who's badgered into repeating a story that adults are telling him or her to repeat. Okay, let's just maybe briefly talk about some of the contemporary resonances of this story before we move on to Disney, the slightly happier, maybe not topic.
Maybe slightly.
so I was thinking about this today. So one is, this was like almost literally a witch hunt. Maybe the closest thing to an actual witch hunt since Salem. And
or since the McCarthy hearings, anyway.
Right, but they were looking for actual supernatural.
Right, you're right. They were looking
for witches, more or less, Satanists.
Yeah.
And Yeah, and the like forced confession kind of thing, and children testifying against adults and stuff like that. And one of President Trump's favorite phrases is witch hunt to talk about the Mueller report. So that continues to be a resonant theme in American life, and he's playing on that to make himself seem falsely accused. The other is,
and he's throwing around the word exonerated like he just learned it, which I find very stressful. Like that always nudges my blood pressure up. Anyway, go on.
So another one is just the idea of kind of like a moral panic, and I don't know if this quite qualifies as a moral panic, but it seems like it does in some ways. And there's a lot of talk about from conservatives talking about the left, saying that like the left is now obsessed with moral panics, and the prime one would be like the Me Too movement, and that focused on like accusations of sexual abuse against men that happened years ago, and I saw that comparison made. I think actually a guest I had on the show brought that up. This idea of people can. Just because there's a bunch of accusations doesn't mean they're true. Like we saw what happened in with the preschools and stuff. And then there's Believe the Children, which is the title of one of the book you held up, right? So that was a phrase that was used during the time to say, yeah, like we believe the children they're telling the truth as you laid out. And there are some people on the left who especially when Me Too broke started saying like we believe the women.
Yeah, believe women.
Yeah, so hashtag believe women, and then that becomes like, oh, you believe women, do you? Well, did you believe the Tawana Brawley or whatever? There's
right.
there's some subset of false accusations of sexual abuse, and people who don't want to acknowledge any accusations of sexual abuse, look at those and to cast doubt on anything else. So I don't know what to make of all of these, but it does seem like. Somehow the
welcome to the uncomfortable area where I live and where I built my cabin.
Right. So, yeah, like the themes that the Satanic ritual abuse brought out are definitely still alive with us today. Maybe not exactly like the Satanism stuff. You don't hear a ton about Satanism in the news anymore. But a lot of the other stuff is still with us.
But it could make a comeback at any time.
There's actually a documentary that I think is called Church of Satan that's coming out. That's about the actual Church of Satan, which is kind of a quasi-religious parody group or something.
Hail Satan?
Yes, I think that's right.
There's the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple. There's an important distinction. There was a rift at a certain point, and they went their separate ways.
Right. So you're right. Hail Satan is the title of the documentary, which I haven't seen yet, but it does look kind of interesting. But yeah, and they kind of portray themselves as not a group that is hoping to summon the Dark Lord, but is like a critique of mainstream religion and doing things like, the in Alabama where they wanted to put a statue or a monument to the Ten Commandments, demanding that they put a monument to, a demon from the Bible or something.
All I believe.
Yeah, there as well. So it's that kind of a little bit like prankstery stuff, but so that's different than the Satanists as they were envisioned in the early 80s, where it was like, this is, I guess it was influenced by like Rosemary's Baby and other Hollywood depictions of Satanists. So anyway, how do you see the story like reflected in, if at all, in today's world?
I mean, to me, the most important distinction, well, first of all, was Salem. What we forget about Salem, because so many of us weren't old enough in the 1690s to be paying any attention, is that one of the key judges in the Salem witch trials after the fact was like, we wrongfully convicted a lot of people. Like, we executed people who did nothing. We need to like sit with this and reckon with this and try and make sure that this never happens again, which prosecutors are not known for doing and judges are not known for doing in this country and places where wrongful convictions occur today. So the courts in Salem, based on some metrics, were operating, more justly than courts in America today. I mean, that's debatable on many counts, but that's my opinion as a historian. And then in terms of moral panic, it's it's really interesting to think about how do moral panics manifest and what kind of a culprit do they tend to point the finger at? Because the Satanic Panic was a moral panic. The kind of cry that Anita Bryant raised in the late 70s about, we have to strip rights from gay men because they're vampires who want to, all they want to do is sexually corrupt and abuse our children, and therefore we have to stop them from being able to work in schools and so on. That was a moral panic. Looking at those, there's, and focusing on, looking at the Satanic Panic as a moral panic, that was something that was motivated by the way that the American status quo, the patriarchy, had created a society that allowed sexual abuse to flourish, and that allowed sexual abuse, even in the late 70s, to be seen as something that, like, if a father is abusing his children, like, obviously the last resort is to take him out of the home. Like, we all know as civilized late 70s Americans that, like, we want to keep the family together at almost all costs. And, even if he's abusing his children, like, we will get him into counseling. We will figure out what his deal is. We will keep the family together. And only as a last resort can we take the patriarch out of the household, because that would be terrible. That would be a broken home, and he has to provide for them. And women aren't supposed to work, and we don't have jobs for them anyway. And if they do work, who's going to take care of the kids? And the daycare sex abuse cases were also a way to stigmatize, no one consciously did this, but what the effect they had was to stigmatize women who wanted to work and who had to put their children in daycare in order to do it.
That's a good point.
And to play on women's anxiety about being outside of the home and on everyone else's anxiety about women being outside of the home. And, the people who suffered in the Satanic Panic were daycare workers, often women. In the Margaret Kelly Michaels case and in other cases, the allegations against them were strengthened by, the idea that, well, Margaret Kelly Michaels is a bisexual, or, the San Antonio Four are lesbians, and therefore they're more likely to abuse children because God knows, lesbians are the most dangerous people in America, as opposed to the ones quietly holding quite a lot together. Like Margaret Kelly Michaels was a bisexual who didn't shower every day, and so am I. And so according to that metric, like, I would be fucked back then. And so we take kind of the revelation in the 70s that sexual abuse of children is something that has been quietly going on in respectable American homes for decades, and no one has noticed it or done anything about it. And it's been this kind of well-kept secret, and no one has been taking the trauma seriously. And the answers to how to address that, unfortunately, for people who have an interest in keeping things the way they are, is to radically recreate the way that American families live and the way that America works, where, if we want to create a world where, women can get their children out of an abusive home, then we need to give them the resources to be able to live without men financially supporting them. And we need to not stigmatize women who have children and are not married. And we need to take seriously the ways that men who function perfectly well in all other aspects of their lives can still terrorize the people in their homes. And if we're talking about child abuse not perpetrated by men in the family, then we need to talk about ways that, holding the extended family together and not wanting to be impolite to anyone also facilitate ongoing child abuse. The problems that kind of rampant child abuse that we started looking at in the 70s pointed to were in keeping with the agenda of feminists at the time, and this idea of, the system that we have of the nuclear family and of the man being the unquestioned head of his household is, like, maybe not healthy for anybody. And instead of addressing that in a significant way, instead of, finding ways to make a society where women were able to reasonably support themselves, where there was affordable childcare,
we stigmatized childcare outside of the home. We made it we made my mother, who could afford daycare, terrified of the entire concept of daycare well into the late 80s and early 90s. We created a world where, no, the problem's not the patriarchy. It's not men. Like, they, once again, are the ones who will protect us and who will prosecute criminals and who will save us from deviance. And the problem really
is Satan?
Lesbian witches. So I think that one of the things that make moral panics dangerous and that make them moral panics is that they identify the symptoms of a problem that the status quo is causing and then blame someone who had nothing to do with inflicting those harms, because they can't, because they're outside of a system of power. They don't have, they find an outsider or a pariah to pin the problems that the system is causing on. And the thing about the Me Too movement is that women are pointing the finger at the actual perpetrators in this one. And we're pointing the finger at systems of power as they exist and as they govern everyone's lives in America, And I do think that one of the things I can see happening is that we imagine that we're going to be taking down the Weinsteins of the world and instead end up with more aggressive sentencing, more aggressive investigations that fall on, the most vulnerable legal subjects in this country, who are always the ones who are more likely to be the victims of wrongful conviction. So, the poor and people of color, people who don't have a way to defend themselves against the law, that's always a possibility. But we don't have to live in a society that takes women's trauma seriously by, overzealously prosecuting people with no resources. That's another story that we've been sold, but we don't have to believe it.
I think that's a good place to end this part of our conversation. We've gone long, but I would like to talk Disney with you for just a little bit. First of all, because talking Satan and Disney in one conversation, I think
gotta make it happen,
is great, and also because you wrote a piece that just went up at the Baffler. We'll include a link. The title is "The Magic Kingdom." The subhead is "The Dark Side of the Disney Dream," and I just read it today. It's very interesting. It's very detailed. It includes you visiting Disney as an adult. It includes talking about a movie that there's some thunder going on here, but everything's fine.
Cool.
It's a movie that I wanted to see but haven't seen yet, called Flutter Project.
Yeah, see it when you want to just feel vulnerable and do some crying, just some Sunday afternoon.
But why don't we start? Why did you want to write about Disney?
Oh boy. Because I went to Disney World and I just could not get my head around it. And I went to Disney World on the second workday of the Trump administration, which is now almost 2.5 years ago now, which is just amazing. I really thought that we would be in nuclear winter by now, but here we are. Fingers crossed. And it felt like I had gone into that. It's like, in Inception, when they go into like 4 levels of dream, they're like in the dream within a dream within a dream. Mm-hmm. That was what Disney World felt like to me at that moment.
How did you end up going to Disney? Like, why were you there as an adult with no children, as far as I know?
Yeah, no, I was there because I was visiting a really dear friend of mine who at the time was living an hour away from Orlando. She was also working for dogs. We have some of the same work experiences. Millennials love working for dogs, I guess. And we had become friends as teenagers, and I've written another piece about this that's much shorter, through the Newsies fandom. We both love Newsies, which...
Yes, I remember that piece. It's a great piece.
Thank you. Yeah, and for anyone who has not had the joy of experiencing it, Newsies is a militantly pro-union musical that Disney inexplicably made in 1992.
Starring a young Christian Bale.
Starring a young Christian Bale, who was hired for not a musical and then had to be in one. And God bless him, he did his best. And he apparently does not like to be reminded of it these days. And so I was visiting her just in the first days of the Trump administration. And I think we just were like, fuck it, let's go to Disney World. Like, this is terrible. Everything feels terrible right now.
And we went, and I remember feeling like on the one hand, really delighted by it. Like, there are parts of Disney World that I love. I love Space Mountain. I start off the piece by talking about how much I love Space Mountain. And actually we did the Space Mountain ride, and then we were leaving, and this ride operator was like, "Hey girls, you want to go again?" We were like, "Yes." And she like let us somehow like secretly cut the line and ride it again. And like, I still don't know how or why that happened, but it was amazing. And I wasn't so worried I was going to die the second time, so I could really appreciate it. But we were there, we spent the day at Disney World, and I remember just also feeling like this is what Disney World is what America really wants to be. Like, this feels like the dream that we were trying to put ourselves in by electing kind of Donald Trump as president. This idea that that he's promising, was running on the platform of being like the capitalist genius president. And like, Walt Disney was an actual capitalist genius, and he created this world where you can go and just not have to think about anything. Everything is taken care of for you. You don't have to make decisions. You don't really have to have a sense of identity. You're just kind of there to be delighted and moved around. And that, this is the world that I felt like people wanted to make America into, those who elected Trump, that this is like the great again.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, the great again and make America great again refers to an idealized 1950s, suburb.
Mm-hmm.
So Leave It to Beaver, more or less.
Celebration, Florida.
Yes, or where can you get that? Main Street, USA, which is totally fake. At least Celebration, Florida is adheres to new urbanist principles, as far as I know. And, it's not just a way to get you to buy souvenirs and ice cream cones and stuff like that. But but yeah, so I wonder, it must be out there somewhere. Like, Trump must have done some sort of Disney tie-in promotion at one point, like in the 80s or 90s, where he's standing in front of the castle with whichever wife he was married to at the time.
Like him, I feel like I can imagine this so vividly. I feel like I must have seen it, but I think this is just how we've learned to think now, like something where it's him and like Mickey, and he's kind of awkwardly like, "Mickey, I love big deals, but this is the biggest deal of all." And then they ride on Big Thunder Mountain.
There's a famous photo of him with 3 or 4 other people in character costumes, and I can't remember who it is exactly, but it might be the Universal Studios monsters or something. So Frankenstein and a werewolf and the Mummy or something, and he's dressed in his standard outfit. And this would have been at the opening of a theme park or something in 2007. But the piece is not really about Trump. It's more about Disney and the desires that Disney fulfills, and then the things that are erased when you're at Disney. And so part of that is this movie, The Florida Project, which came out 2 years ago.
Fall of 2017.
And Willem Dafoe is the only known actor in it, but really it's the main character. Who's the main character? Is it the young mother or the child?
Yeah, the main character is the child. So a 6-year-old girl named Mooney, and it's really very much from her perspective, and seeing this world of this, this rundown pay by the week motel where she lives through her eyes. And they're kind of living, at right outside of Disney World, where it's all 99-cent off-brand souvenirs of Mackie Mouse and that kind of a thing.
So you have an interesting analysis of this film, which made me actually want to see it. I think I even had the DVD out from the library at one point, but they didn't get around to watching it. But
it's a hard world. There's so we can never watch all the DVDs.
Exactly.
Anyway.
But it attracted some critical acclaim. I remember the Slate Culture Gabfest. They talked about it and were raving about it. And Dafoe was nominated for an Oscar, and that was the only Oscar that this movie made, which is it was a very small indie movie. What do you see as the I guess when I saw the trailer to the movie, I guess that there were people. The thing that I think Slate said was it seems like this is gonna be a movie in which an adorable Moppet, warms the frozen heart of a crusty old saloon keeper or whatever. The
motel manager.
Yeah, and so they like mismarketed the movie, and it did not portray what it's actually about. So what are the actual themes of this film?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a movie about just what it is like to live in grinding poverty, basically. And that this is from the perspective of a 6-year-old girl whose mom is, has priors, was working as a stripper, and then got fired because she wouldn't go into a back room and do extras. And essentially is struggling to, and like, if she got a job, would spend it all on childcare, essentially. Childcare is a recurring theme, and is trying to support herself and her young child in an America that claims to love mothers and children above all else, and claims to love the child and want to protect the child, and does absolutely nothing for them in terms of giving resources to parents, to single parents, to people living in poverty, to kids living in poverty, and just kind of her about her mom doing her best to kind of hold a stable existence for them together, and that sort of falling apart, as happens every day in this country. And so just a story that is so commonplace that we just forget the heartbreak of it. And also about, just this, to me, also the story of this little girl who's raised by a mom who has problems, has a whole kind of traumatic history that we can kind of guess at based on the performance that the actress who plays her, Bria Benate, gives, who should have been nominated for an Oscar, but I'm not in charge of these things. And who, in the midst of all of this instability and all of this omnipresent danger just at the margins, also is, to me, is raised by a mother who loves her and who lets her know that she's loved and that she's a good kid, as she is, and kind of goes off and has adventures and finds her way around this world. And there's, a scene that I love where the little girl Mooney has a new friend who's just moved into the motel next door named Jancy. And so their mom takes them hitchhiking, which you watch as any kind of nice, polite, middle-class American are like, tut, tut, how dangerous. How could you expose your child to that? And takes them hitchhiking and to this parking lot kind of at the edge of Disney World property, and celebrates one of the girls' birthday by, watching from the other side of the fence the fireworks that they have every night at the Magic Kingdom at Disney World. And it's that's for you. Those are your fireworks. And that's in this world where everything is difficult, nothing is free. You're kind of living in this day-to-day uncertainty, this day-to-day fear of how am I going to pay next week's rent? How am I going to make it? That you kind of find a way as a parent and as a human to kind of clear space for the wonder, and to do something, to do what you can for the children in your life. And so it's about the reality of parenting versus the fantasy of it in America, I think. Mm-hmm. And I saw it, and just it really affected me. And then I went back the next day and brought my best friend to see it with me. And so really, I saw that at the end of 2017. And so I feel like this piece is kind of a Frankensteining together of two of the experiences at the beginning and the end of that year that really kind of lodged in my heart and that I didn't know what to do with, and wrote a very long essay about. So
okay, you've convinced me to see Florida Project. Hooray! And I don't know if you've convinced me to go to Disney.
I think that
what you're not trying to do.
Disney will pull you in like a magnet, whether you want it to or not, at some point in your life potentially. And I can never have a hand in that. Disney is stronger than all of us.
That's true. I was thinking, reading this and talking to some friends, some of whom have children that are getting to the age where they know about Disney and want to go there. During my childhood, it really was like the holy grail of what we wanted. And like a kid would go to Disney, and like like I grew up in New Jersey, so it was a flight away, and like everyone would know. And when they would get back, they would like tell what they saw at Disney and all the great things, and like was there a new ride or what happened, and how amazing it was. And it's just like this incredible like marketing achievement that they get. This is like a 6-year-old kid is like proselytizing to the fellow students about you have to convince your parents to book the whole family flights to Florida and then, take you to Disney so you can see the wonders that are there.
I mean, if you have a first grader doing high pressure sales tactics in the home, like your work is being done for you.
Yes,
right? It doesn't get better than that.
It's incredible. And one other part of this essay that I wanted to touch on briefly was on the theme of mothers and children, especially in Disney movies. And you talk about Dumbo, which I have not seen since I was a kid. And there's a new version out as well that is inexplicably, exists for no reason that we can understand besides like they just want to make money, which is, it's a corporation. But Disney is redoing all of its classics as live action for strange reasons.
Weird.
Just just as a cash cow. And but they did Dumbo, which I guess is like a very short. It's like an hour or less, and they had to add on like all this extra stuff because there's just not a lot there to actually. Also,
the original Dumbo is very racist.
Yes, they cut the racism, they cut the crows, and like I mean there's a lot of racism threaded throughout like a lot of Disney movies, even ones from our childhood. But like if you've seen I did see Lady and the Tramp as an adult a couple years ago.
Oh boy.
That is very racist. All the supporting dogs are stereotypical representations of their like national breed origin. So like there's like the German dog acts like officious and stuff, and there's like the Chihuahua is like drunk and lazy. So it's just like shockingly racist.
Wow.
So
and it's funny too because it's not even like where they need to be racist for plot somehow. They're like, let's do racist dogs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that one's from the 60s. It was just like, this is what people like. They love like racial humor and stuff, and probably people mostly did like that kind of thing back then. But anyway, there's this theme of the absent parent, especially the absent mother, in a lot of these Disney movies. Bambi being maybe the classic one, but Dumbo's mother is like taken to the zoo jail or something.
Dumbo's mother is incarcerated. Let's not put too fine a point on it.
Why is she? Because I really don't remember Dumbo very well. She commits a crime or something?
According to the circus, I guess, which is who's the boss of them. Dumbo's mother is essentially protecting him from being taunted and attacked by these like little kids, and protects her child. It's the same story as the Florida Project. Like, you will be hauled away and put in the pokey for protecting your kid, and is put in elephant jail. And it's too like I can't like the job I have chosen for myself as a journalist is to research the saddest things in the world, and like. I do fine with that. Like, I make it sustainable. I cannot talk about Dumbo without bursting into tears. It's too much. Yeah, Dumbo's mom is put in elephant jail, and I think it says Mad Elephant. She's in this cell, and there's a scene where she reaches her trunk out, and like picks up Dumbo and holds him and rocks him. And then it's like and then he solves the situation by learning how to fly using the ears that he was taunted for, and then making a ton of money for the circus, who then are like, oh, you're valuable. We'll give you your mom back, I guess. It's not great.
It's strange. And I think I just know about this because they're on the episode of Slate Culture Catfest where they discussed it. They talked a little bit about the history of the movie, and I'm probably going to get this a little bit wrong, but but I guess Disney was in kind of financial straits at that point because Fantasia had come out and was kind of a bust.
Didn't become a hit until people went and got high and saw it in the 60s, so there was a 20-year latency period.
Right, so so they'd only made like 5 or 6 movies as a studio at this point, maybe fewer than that, and then they wanted to do something that was like easy and they thought would be like a guaranteed a guaranteed hit and also short. Like I said, I think it's like 62 minutes or something.
And they're just like, sadness.
But it's interesting that they, as far as I know, it's an original idea. I don't know if there's a legend or a myth or a fable of Dumbo, whereas most of the other ones were based on like German, Grimm fairy tales or stuff like that. But I think so Absent Mother, Dead Mother, all of the ones that came out like in the late 80s or early 90s. There's no mom for the main character. And that does seem to be part of the, like core myth of Disney is like either it's an orphan, or there's no mother, and then the child needs to like kind of figure out what to do on their own because the father is kind of like a standoffish king or something who can't really intervene too much to help the child.
Standoffish or an idiot, basically. Yeah.
So that is. I'm sure there's been like PhD theses written on the theme of mothers and children and absent mothers in Disney, but these are the like most popular children's stories of the past 100 years, and most of them the mom is off screen, whereas if you think about it, the mom is the most important person to the child in most cases. I don't know. Maybe it should be fleshed out into a full essay by someone. I think.
Well, it's funny. So I'm staying with my friends who have a 2-year-old. And so we've watched a lot of the Land Before Time movies this week. There are 14 of them.
Oh my God.
Yes.
That's
there are
crazy.
more Land Before Time movies than there are Friday the 13th movies, which is how you know, like, you've really gotten into deep water with a franchise. And we watched The Lion King the other day. And so my friend and my 2 friends whose toddler this is, they're both professional writers, which is very interesting because like they clearly are thinking more about story and how it works and what's meaningful and what's satisfying than the people who wrote these movies probably did, especially when you get to like Land Before Time X. So my friend Patrick was saying when we were watching The Lion King, like, I get like why they kill Mufasa. That's spoiler. You do that as like, it makes the journey work. It makes Simba like immediately sympathetic. You care about him as a character, but like in real life, like you don't just have a parent die when you're really young and then you just kind of like move on and do your journey. It's like a defining feature of your life. Like you're going to like be dealing with it and kind of defined by it forever in some way. And it's not just a way to, what he was saying is that he feels like Disney kind of uses it as a shortcut to make a character compelling, as opposed to treating it as a major traumatic event, really. Which is why I'm such a big fan of Moana.
Moana is very good, yeah.
Yeah, because it's about a girl with 2 living parents who has an adventure on purpose. Like, she's like, I need to go do this thing to take care of my people. Like, I'm going to go do it. And then she teams up with The Rock, who's an idiot, and like has to make all the decisions herself. And like also how so much of the hero's journey, which is like standard Disney, is like, you don't want to have an adventure, but it just like happens to you and you have to deal with it. And your parent dies and you're like thrust into, all of these events. And how there's also Disney has been surprisingly reluctant historically to give us characters with agency, because that seems to be, I don't know, I find characters with agency more interesting, but there appears to be some kind of financial or kind of story-making reckoning there where there's a sense that like someone whose stuff just happens to is easier to identify with than someone who makes choices. But in conclusion, watch The Florida Project. And then watch Moana, because you're going to need it.
Yeah, Moana will definitely cheer you up. And I recommend watching that as well. It's a great soundtrack also. It's Lin-Manuel Miranda did the soundtrack. Okay, so on that uplifting note, we should probably end. We were thinking about talking about dogs, but I think we've gone too long, so we'll have to save that for next time.
I will go do my dog writing, and then I'll bring that back to you, and we can talk about it.
Okay, great. So Sarah Marshall, you are on Twitter. Is it remember_Sarah?
It is. Oh my
remember
goodness.
_Sarah with an H.
You remember the underscore.
And you are an entertaining presence there, and you have numerous running themes, including something we thought about talking about, but I guess we kind of forgot about, which is Teen Lawyer.
Oh yeah, next time.
A TV show.
That's a show about an imaginary show about a girl who makes choices and has adventure. Well, no, she does have a dead dad. Oh fuck! I did the Disney thing. I have to go think about this.
It's deep in the mythos, the DNA, the cultural DNA. You've kind of created a imaginary like 80s or 90s sitcom about a teen lawyer. And lots of other stuff as well. And I'm on Twitter as ARYHW. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, viewers and listeners. And we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.